the mystery.
Some structures stand not because of stone or wood, but because of the cries buried beneath them. The night hung heavy over the abandoned grounds, a suffocating darkness that seemed to press against every wall and stone. Moonlight struggled to pierce through the thick clouds, casting thin, trembling streaks of silver across the ruined foundations. The villagers knew better than to approach after midnight. They whispered of the pillar hidden within the ground, a pillar built not of wood or iron, but of human bones, and of the restless spirit trapped inside. Long ago, during an era of ceaseless warfare, the fortress that once dominated these hills could not withstand the earth's shifting and the relentless storms. Builders tried everything: reinforced stone, deep trenches, countless prayers, yet the walls kept crumbling. In desperation, they turned to an ancient ritual, one as cruel as it was secret. Ningyo-bashira, the human pillar. A life would be offered to the earth, buried within the very foundation of the structure, in the belief that a soul bound in suffering would hold the fortress together for eternity. It was said that a young woman, innocent and trembling, was chosen for this sacrifice. Her body, stripped of warmth and hope, became the core of the foundation. Her bones were stacked and entwined, forming a grim column rising from the stone floor. Villagers claimed that even in death, her fingers clawed at the air, her lips frozen in a scream no one could hear, her eyes eternally wide in terror. Generations passed, yet the stories remained. Travelers who mocked superstition would carry lanterns to the ruins, certain they would find only stones and debris. Some returned pale and silent, eyes hollow, refusing to recount what they had seen. Others vanished completely, swallowed by the dark earth, leaving nothing but unsettled whispers behind. The villagers said softly, almost in resignation, "They went beneath the earth. They will never come back." Even now, during storm-laden nights when wind rattles the broken walls, faint sounds rise from the foundation. A hollow tapping like bones knocking together. A low, sorrowful moan that creeps along the edges of perception, carried on the wind from somewhere deep below. The ruins seem alive, as though the earth itself remembers the anguish of the past, and the young woman's spirit waits, tethered eternally to her pillar of bones. No one knows what awaits those who dare linger too long. Some claim to see fleeting shadows crossing the broken stones, glimpses of a pale hand reaching upward. Others swear they have heard whispers in languages long forgotten, begging for release. Whatever the truth, the stories remain unbroken, carried from one generation to the next, a warning to those curious enough to venture near. And so, the ruins sleep uneasily beneath the cold moonlight, a testament to the cruel ingenuity of men and the indomitable grip of the dead. The pillar of bone stands at the center, silent yet full of motion, waiting for the night when the living will stumble upon it once more. And this is where the story begins. The land surrounding the ruined fortress had long been a witness to bloodshed and ambition. In the early 1570s, during Japan's Warring States period, regional daimyo waged endless campaigns, carving territories with fire and sword, leaving villages trembling beneath the shadow of war. The fortress that once crowned this hill was built around 1573 by a local lord seeking to defend his domain from rival warlords. Perched on a steep rise, the stone walls stretched like claws toward the sky, overlooking rivers that carved deep into the valley below, and dense forests of cedar and pine that whispered secrets when the wind blew. Despite the fortress's imposing presence, the hill itself was treacherous. Heavy winters brought avalanches and frost that cracked walls. Torrential summer rains eroded the foundations. Builders tried every method known to man, reinforcing the stone with timber and iron, laying drainage trenches and performing elaborate prayers to local kami. Yet nature and time mocked their efforts. By 1577, after 4 years of repeated collapses, the fortress had become a haunted shell, its towers unstable and gates threatening to give way. It was in this climate of desperation that the legend of the Ningyo-bashira, the human pillar, took root. According to chronicles recorded later in the early 17th century, villagers were summoned to provide a life to anchor the fortress, a soul to hold the stone steady against the earth's unrest. The practice itself was not unique. Across Japan, scattered accounts suggest that between the 15th and 17th centuries, Ningyo-bashira rituals were performed to stabilize bridges, dams, and fortifications. Yet the story attached to this fortress was particularly notorious. The chosen victim was said to be a young woman of unparalleled beauty, selected in 1577 to be buried alive beneath the central keep. Her bones were placed carefully within the foundation, entwined in a column that became the axis of the entire fortress. The fortress itself had been a marvel of construction. Massive gates carved with protective symbols, timber beams bound with iron, and towers that clawed at the clouds all bore the mark of meticulous craftsmanship. But beneath this display of human ingenuity lay the dark truth. The foundation, strengthened with stone and timber, was secretly reinforced with human sacrifice. By 1578, the fortress had withstood winter snows, summer storms and sieges, and the villagers quietly attributed its miraculous stability to the life bound within its heart. The surrounding villages retained vivid memories of that night in 1577. Elderly villagers later recounted the screams echoing through the valleys, the earth seeming to drink the blood of the young woman as her bones were stacked into the base of the keep. From that night, the fortress no longer crumbled. Towers that once swayed with the wind held firm. Walls that had split reopened as though touched by some unseen hand. Yet the villagers sensed the terrible price. Strange sounds filled the air. Faint taps and scraping noises emanated from below the floors. Shadows moved where lanterns could not reach, and a cold, watching presence seemed to linger in every hallway. By 1582, the fortress had survived multiple assaults during the campaigns that followed Oda Nobunaga's campaigns in central Japan. Each attack left the walls intact, confounding enemies and inspiring superstition. Samurai who stationed themselves in the fortress at night reported hearing low, sorrowful moans echoing off the walls, and some claimed to glimpse pale hands reaching from cracks in the stone. Though written records from the time are scarce, oral histories from the region describe a figure in white, gliding silently through the corridors during storms, her eyes wide and mournful. Over the centuries, as the Warring States period ended and the Tokugawa shogunate established its rule in 1603, the fortress fell into disuse. By 1610, the daimyo who had commissioned its construction had died, and the fortress, though still standing, had lost its strategic relevance. Nature began reclaiming the land. Forests thickened around the stone walls, moss and lichen crept over timber beams, and the river carved deeper into the valley below, threatening the lower walls. Travelers and pilgrims who ventured near the ruins reported unsettling experiences. Shadows flitting across broken stones, sudden chills, the soft sound of sobbing carried on the wind. The spatial layout of the fortress contributed to its ominous reputation. Narrow, winding stairways led into subterranean chambers beneath the central keep, the walls slick with moss and residue from centuries of decay. Courtyards once bustling with soldiers now lay silent except for crows nesting in the towers. At the very center of the largest hall lay the human pillar, though centuries of erosion had exposed parts of its grim structure. Archaeologists in the late 19th century, during the Meiji Restoration, noted the unusual alignment of remaining stones and beams, theorizing that the builders had deliberately arranged them to channel some force unknown to modern engineering, perhaps the restless energy of the soul buried within. Even by the 20th century, the fortress retained its eerie reputation. In 1924, local newspapers reported that hikers near the ruins heard the sound of bones knocking together during thunderstorms. Travelers spoke of fleeting shadows and soft whispers amid the trees. Anthropologists and folklorists visiting the site documented villagers' enduring belief in the spirit that guarded the fortress, noting that the legend of the young woman, whose bones formed the human pillar, remained central to the collective memory of the region. Thus, the legend persists, a fusion of history, geography, and ritual. The Warring States period, with its cruelty and desperation, had forged not only a fortress of stone and timber, but also a monument to human sacrifice. Those who walk near the ruins today feel a tangible weight in the air, a subtle pressure that hints at the centuries-old bond between flesh, stone, and spirit. Shadows stretch unnaturally across cracked walls, and the wind carries a mournful rhythm, echoing the suffering of the young woman bound to her pillar of bones. Time has passed. Dynasties have risen and fallen, yet the fortress and the cursed houses remain waiting silently beneath the moonlight. In the summer of 1577, the fortress's desperate construction had reached its breaking point. The walls, weakened by repeated storms and minor earthquakes, threatened to collapse entirely. Lord Takeda, a stern and calculating daimyo, summoned all the skilled carpenters, masons, and laborers from surrounding villages, demanding that they reinforce the keep before the next monsoon. Among the workers was a young girl named Ayame. Only 16, she lived on the outskirts of the hill, tending rice fields with her mother and younger brother. She had heard whispers of the fortress's curse, the legend of the Ningyo-bashira, but dismissed them as childish tales. That is, until the Lord's advisors came to her village with the decree: one life must be offered to ensure the fortress stood firm. Ayame was chosen. The villagers protested in vain. The law of the Lord was absolute, and superstition only strengthened his resolve. Ayame's mother clutched her hands, her voice trembling as she begged for mercy, while her brother buried his face in the dirt and sobbed. Soldiers arrived the next morning, their armor clinking, to escort Ayame to the fortress. Her eyes, wide with fear, never left the looming stone walls. Inside the keep, the master carpenter, an aging man named Hiroshi, prepared the foundations. He had heard stories from his father, who had once labored under similar circumstances, and he feared the consequences of completing the ritual. Yet he dared not speak, knowing that disobedience could cost him his life. The chamber below the central hall was cleared, stone and timber arranged meticulously, and a pit dug deep enough to contain the human pillar at the heart of the fortress. As Ayame descended the narrow stairs to the subterranean chamber, the air grew cold and heavy. The torches flickered, shadows dancing across the damp walls, and the faint scent of earth and decay filled her nostrils. She whispered prayers under her breath, though she did not know if any kami could hear them in this place of sorrow. Soldiers held her firmly, guiding her toward the pit, their faces pale and tense. Once positioned, Hiroshi and the laborers began the grim task of placing Ayame's body into the foundation. Her bones, once separated from flesh and stacked according to ritual instructions, formed the core of the human pillar. The workers chanted quietly, their voices strained and somber, attempting to appease whatever spirit now bound itself to the earth. The stones above her were laid carefully, compressing the bones into a solid column. By the time the work was completed, the chamber fell silent, save for the distant wind rattling through the keep and the faint, impossible sound of scratching from below, a reminder that the spirit had already begun to stir. In the days that followed, strange occurrences were noted by everyone within the fortress. Soldiers reported hearing footsteps echoing along the hallways at night when no one was there. Doors slammed without wind, and objects moved inexplicably. The once rattling walls of the keep now held firm, as if the Ningyo-bashira had indeed anchored the fortress. Yet the cost was evident, a pervasive feeling of unease, a weight pressing on the chest of anyone who lingered too long. Even Lord Takeda, who had decreed the sacrifice, confessed in private moments that he felt watched, his nights haunted by visions of a pale girl reaching through stone. The villagers, meanwhile, were tormented by guilt and fear. Mothers warned their children never to speak of the fortress or venture near it. Travelers who passed the hill at night claimed they heard faint crying as though someone or something was still trapped beneath the stone. By autumn of 1577, the story of Ayame's fate had spread throughout the surrounding region, cementing the fortress's reputation as a place where human suffering was woven into the very foundation of stone and timber. Thus, the stage was set. The fortress, stabilized by sacrifice, became a magnet for fear and fascination. The central pillar of bones held the structure, and Ayame's spirit, bound by ritual, became an unseen presence within the walls. Soldiers, laborers, and villagers alike felt her gaze even in silence. A reminder that the fortress was not merely stone and timber, but a monument to human despair and endurance. It was here, in the subterranean shadows of the fortress, that the legend of the Ningyo-bashira intertwined with history, setting in motion a story of terror that would echo for centuries to come. As the first winter after Ayame's sacrifice settled over the hill, the fortress began to reveal its darker secrets. The walls that had withstood storms and siege seemed almost alive. Soldiers stationed in the towers whispered of faint knocks and scratches coming from beneath the stone floors. At first, the sounds were dismissed as wind or settling timber, but soon even the most skeptical found themselves unable to ignore them. In December of 1577, during one particularly bitter night, a sentry named Katsuro patrolled the inner courtyard. The snow had fallen thickly, muffling the usual clatter of the fortress. As he passed the main hall, he saw a figure drifting along the corridor. Pale, almost translucent, with arms outstretched as if reaching for something unseen, it glided silently between the torches. When he raised his voice in alarm, the figure vanished, leaving only a cold that sank to his bones. Word spread quickly among the garrison. The fortress was haunted, and the legend of the human pillar, once whispered, became spoken in fear. Strange occurrences multiplied in the following months. Objects moved without touch. Doors creaked open or slammed shut on their own. Soldiers reported soft crying emanating from the walls, sometimes accompanied by a faint scratching, like fingernails against stone. Those who ventured into the subterranean chamber beneath the central hall described drafts cold enough to freeze breath and whispers in languages they did not understand. Some felt invisible hands brushing against their skin. Others glimpsed shadows darting just beyond the flicker of torchlight. By spring 1578, the supernatural presence became nearly impossible to ignore. Horses refused to enter stables near the keep. Food supplies vanished mysteriously, and minor injuries among the garrison seemed to multiply without explanation. Hiroshi, the aging master carpenter, approached Lord Takeda in private. He admitted, voice trembling, that while the ritual had preserved the fortress's walls, it had also awakened a presence, a consciousness bound within the human pillar. This was no mere protective spirit. It was the restless soul of Ayame, aware, sentient, and growing increasingly aware of the world above. The villagers' observations corroborated these reports. In March, a local farmer reported hearing sobbing carried on the wind as he walked home, punctuated by a sharp, hollow sound of bone striking stone. Another villager described a pale hand pressing against the frame of a door before disappearing. By summer, these reports had become routine. Travelers avoided the hill, and those daring to climb it spoke of an oppressive atmosphere, a sensation of unseen eyes watching their every movement. The fortress itself seemed to shift subtly, as though influenced by the will of the pillar. Corridors felt longer than they should be. Stairs occasionally seemed to tilt underfoot. Soldiers claimed to hear voices urging them, guiding them, sometimes warning them, sometimes mocking them. Patrols reported hearing footsteps echoing in empty halls, indistinct whispers, and the faint clatter of bone within stone, as if the pillar itself were responding to their presence. During a violent thunderstorm in October 1578, the supernatural manifestations intensified. Lightning revealed fleeting glimpses of a pale figure suspended mid-air, reaching toward the garrison. Thunderclaps echoed unnaturally, synchronized with the tapping sounds from below. Several soldiers collapsed in terror, claiming the walls themselves had moved against them. Word spread through the fortress like wildfire. The human pillar was awake, its influence now impossible to contain. By the winter of 1578-1579, even the most hardened veterans of Lord Takeda's forces admitted the fortress had become unpredictable. One night, a group of soldiers reported being chased through the corridors by a pale, silent figure. Doors slammed shut behind them, trapping them temporarily, while unseen forces seemed to block every escape. Those who survived spoke only in whispers, and some were so traumatized that they left the garrison entirely. Refusing to return to the hill, the central pillar, buried deep beneath the grand hall, pulsed with an unseen energy. Those who approached it felt an irresistible compulsion to lean closer, to peer into the cracks, to listen. A young recruit, unable to resist, spent hours near the chamber entrance in November 1579, claiming to hear Ayame's voice pleading for release, recounting her fear and sorrow. Other soldiers drawn to the pillar reported visions of shadowy figures trapped within the stone, their eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams. Even nature seemed affected by the human pillar. Wolves avoided the forests surrounding the hill, while birds vanished from the area entirely. Crops in nearby fields failed mysteriously, as if the life force of the land itself had been disturbed. Storms seemed more violent when passing over the fortress, as though the weather were drawn to the pillar's unrest. By the following spring, the entire region regarded the hill as cursed, and local inhabitants avoided it entirely after dusk. Visitors from distant towns reported similar phenomena. Merchants passing near the ruins swore they felt sudden chills, saw shadows flitting across walls, and heard soft sobbing from deep within the stone floors. In 1580, an itinerant monk visiting the fortress recorded in his journal, "The walls breathe sorrow, the stones themselves weep. The girl entombed beneath the hall stirs, her spirit bound by hands crueler than nature, reaching ever upward in eternal plea." Over time, the events coalesced into a pattern. Storms triggered heightened activity, the presence grew more restless during the night, and the fortress seemed to pulse as if alive. Soldiers stationed there learned to avoid the lower chambers entirely, leaving offerings of incense, in hopes of appeasing whatever consciousness resided within the pillar. Yet none could deny that the ritual had succeeded in one sense. The fortress, once crumbling, now stood firm. Its walls resisted earthquakes, its towers survived lightning strikes, and the moat stone embankments held against floodwaters. By late 1580, the fortress's legend had spread far beyond the surrounding villages. Travelers spoke of shadowy figures, strange sounds, and an oppressive weight in the air. Scholars and monks recorded accounts of the Ningyo-bashira, debating its moral and spiritual implications. The human pillar remained at the heart of the fortress, silent yet active, a bridge between the world of the living and the dead. It had become not just a foundation of stone and timber, but a nexus of terror, a monument to sacrifice, and a vessel for the restless spirit of Ayame, whose sorrow had bound the fortress together, but cursed all who dwelled within its shadow. By 1581, the fortress had transformed from a military stronghold into a monument of dread. The walls no longer merely stood. They seemed to breathe, to watch, to respond. Soldiers stationed within reported events that could not be explained by wind, settling stone, or superstition. The human pillar at the fortress's heart had awakened fully, its restless spirit now reaching through every hall, corridor, and stairwell. One of the earliest accounts came from Masahiro, a young sentry, who detailed an encounter that would haunt him for years. On a moonless night in January 1581, he patrolled the inner courtyard, his lantern swaying in the biting wind. From the shadows of the main hall, he saw a figure, pale, translucent, hair floating as if underwater, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The figure moved silently, arms extended as though searching for something just out of reach. Masahiro froze, his breath catching in his throat, and when he mustered the courage to call out, the figure vanished, leaving behind only a cold that seeped into his bones. He collapsed to his knees, trembling, and refused to return to the courtyard for 3 days. By February, similar accounts began surfacing among the garrison. Soldiers spoke of objects moving on their own, doors opening or slamming shut without reason, and soft sobbing emanating from the walls themselves. The noises often sounded like fingernails scraping stone. Even the most pragmatic men, hardened by years of combat, admitted to feeling watched as though unseen eyes followed every movement. Those who lingered near the central hall above the human pillar reported hearing faint whispers in languages they did not know, voices imploring them to leave or warning them of a pain beyond human comprehension. Villagers in the valley below corroborated these stories. Farmers walking home at dusk heard cries echoing across the hills, a mixture of wails and whispered pleas. Children insisted that a pale woman watched them from the tree line, following silently, but vanishing when approached. Tools left unattended disappeared, only to reappear in impossible locations. A sickle embedded in a barn wall, a plow lodged in a tree trunk, even a kettle perched atop a roof. Adults grew wary, forbidding their children to approach the hill, while travelers altered routes to avoid the cursed fortress entirely. In March, a traveling monk arrived, seeking to investigate the fortress. In his journal he recorded, "The stones themselves weep. The wind carries the lament of the girl beneath. Each step within the halls awakens her sorrow. The earth itself conspires to make the living aware of the price of ambition. The air grows heavier with every passing hour. Even the light of torches seems to recoil from her presence." The monk described cold drafts that froze his breath, and scratching sounds that echoed from above, even when he was alone in subterranean corridors. He noted that the phenomena intensified near the central hall, the resting place of the human pillar, and that the very walls appeared to hum with unseen energy. Soldiers developed their own methods of survival. Some left offerings of rice or incense, whispering prayers meant to pacify Ayame's spirit. Others carried charms, though many noted that these were only partially effective. Nights were sleepless, as the sensation of invisible hands grazing shoulders became commonplace. Some claimed to see fleeting shadows at the edge of torchlight, disappearing when confronted. By summer, even the bravest among them admitted to a pervasive sense of dread, a feeling that the fortress itself had become a predator. By October 1582, events escalated. During a violent thunderstorm, lightning illuminated the central hall, revealing a pale figure suspended mid-air, arms reaching toward the garrison. Thunderclaps seemed synchronized with faint knocks emanating from below the floor, as if the bones of the human pillar were striking one another. Several soldiers collapsed in terror, while others fled the corridors convinced the fortress had come alive. Word spread rapidly. The human pillar had fully awakened, and the restless spirit demanded recognition. In the months that followed, the fortress became unpredictable. Footsteps echoed where none should exist. Doors locked and unlocked themselves. Shadows moved against the direction of torchlight. Objects levitated briefly before crashing to the ground. Those who approached the subterranean chamber felt an irresistible pull, an urge to lean closer, to peer into the cracks. Some obeyed the compulsion and returned traumatized, eyes wide with terror, whispering incoherent warnings. Others disappeared entirely, never to be seen again. Villagers reported increasingly disturbing signs as well. In the winter of 1583, a farmer claimed he awoke to find his barn doors open, his animals huddled in a corner, and a pale figure standing at the threshold. The figure stared silently before vanishing, leaving the faint sound of sobbing and a metallic clatter like bones striking stone. Children in the area began speaking of lullabies sung in strange voices, echoing in dreams and waking hours alike. Travelers passing the hill reported similar encounters, often describing the figure of a girl in white drifting through trees, always watching, never blinking. Soldiers stationed in the fortress recorded patterns in the supernatural events. Storms provoked activity. Lightning and wind coincided with bone tapping, and the distant sound of soft weeping. Moonless nights intensified hallucinations, visions of the girl appearing in corridors or descending from battlements. The central hall became a nexus of unrest, with the human pillar pulsing subtly, a silent heartbeat of anguish. Even those unaware of its existence felt a strange compulsion near the chamber, as though an invisible force guided their attention toward the stone foundation. Accounts became more horrifying by 1584. Soldiers reported whispers mimicking the voices of comrades. Figures appeared fleetingly, disappearing when approached, leaving behind a trail of icy air and a faint metallic smell. The air inside the fortress often became inexplicably cold, causing breath to fog even in summer. Attempts to flee were sometimes thwarted. Travelers became disoriented in the surrounding forests, returning hours or days later, dazed and pale, muttering incomprehensible warnings. By late 1585, the fortress's reputation had spread widely. Chroniclers noted its uncanny preservation, despite centuries of storms, earthquakes, and neglect. attributing its endurance to the supernatural pillar. Scholars visiting the site remarked that while the fortress's structure remained impressive, the human experiences within were undeniable. Pervasive fear, inexplicable sounds, fleeting apparitions, and a sense of being constantly observed. One account from a visiting monk read, "The fortress stands firm, yet it devours the peace of those who dwell within. A soul anchors it, unwilling to rest, and its presence is felt in every stone and shadow." Soldiers attempting to document the phenomena describe direct interactions with Ayame's spirit. Some claim she reached out from the walls, brushing against their skin or whispering warnings. Others witnessed objects levitating or doors slamming without cause. Shadows moved independently of light sources, and the soft tapping of bones beneath the floor accompanied nearly every storm. Entire nights passed with no explanation for the strange phenomena, each event reinforcing the fortress's reputation as a locus of human suffering and supernatural power. Villagers' reports were no less chilling. A woman in the valley recounted seeing the girl walking through her fields at dawn, stopping to stare at the fortress, never blinking. Children described waking to whispers in their ears, lullabies in voices they did not recognize, accompanied by the sound of scratching and faint sobbing. Hunters claimed their prey vanished, leaving only trails leading back to the fortress. The hill had become an area adults avoided entirely, a place of dread and fascination where the living could feel the presence of the dead. By 1586, the fortress had become a site of legend, a monument to the extremes of human ambition and desperation. Even Lord Takeda, who had sanctioned Ayame's sacrifice, reportedly avoided spending nights within its walls. Soldiers and villagers alike lived under the weight of her presence, the human pillar anchoring not just the fortress, but an enduring legacy of horror. Each storm, shadow, and whisper reinforced the notion that Ayame's spirit remained bound, a living force within the stone and timber. Thus the fortress, once celebrated for its architectural brilliance, became synonymous with terror. Its walls, its corridors, its subterranean chambers all bore witness to the suffering of the human pillar. Soldiers, villagers, and travelers were compelled to confront an ancient horror, one that had anchored the fortress physically and spiritually. Ayame's sorrow, despair, and restless will continued to resonate through the centuries, leaving an indelible mark on history, legend, and the land itself. The fortress had transcended time, stone and timber preserved, walls unyielding, yet alive with the echoes of a sacrifice no living soul could ever forget. It had become not just a stronghold, but a testament to human cruelty, desperation, and the enduring, inescapable grip of the supernatural. By the winter of 1587, the fortress had transformed into something beyond human comprehension. What had once been stone, timber, and human ingenuity now seemed alive, a breathing entity tied to the restless spirit of Ayame. Every corridor, every stairwell, every hall thrummed with an energy that defied explanation. Soldiers stationed within spoke of whispers echoing from empty walls, of shadows that moved independently of the flickering torches, and of cold hands brushing their shoulders in the dead of night. During one particularly violent storm in December, a group of soldiers patrolling the inner courtyard witnessed the floor beneath them shudder. A deep hollow tapping resonated through the fortress, echoing like bones striking stone. The sound grew louder, faster, and more chaotic, until the men could no longer distinguish it from the wails that pierced the air, a scream at once human and otherworldly, filled with anguish, despair, and rage. Doors slammed violently without wind, and shadows raced along the walls, elongating, twisting, and converging in impossible angles. The soldiers, paralyzed with fear, felt a magnetic pull from the central hall where the human pillar rested. Some attempted to resist. Others screamed, clawing at the walls, but none could escape the sensation that the fortress itself sought to claim them. Villagers who had remained in the valley below reported equally terrifying phenomena. They swore that during storms, the fortress appeared to float above the hill, shrouded in mist, its windows glowing with a spectral light. Children recounted hearing footsteps in the forest at night, accompanied by soft sobbing and faint clattering sounds, as if the bones of the human pillar were being struck from below. Adults dared not leave their homes after dusk, whispering warnings to their children about the pale woman who demanded acknowledgement for her suffering. Travelers who had previously passed near the hill now altered their routes, recounting experiences of disorientation, nausea, and visions of a girl in white gliding through the trees, always watching, always following. The peak of the phenomenon coincided with the spring of 1588. The fortress seemed to anticipate human movement. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors before anyone entered, doors slammed preemptively, and shadows coalesced in corners, visible only peripherally, vanishing when directly confronted. Soldiers stationed in the fortress felt cold air brush their skin, accompanied by whispers urging them to leave or kneel in apology. The central hall above the human pillar pulsed visibly, the stones themselves seeming to breathe in rhythm with the unseen heartbeat of Ayame. One monk, who had journeyed to the fortress to perform rituals of appeasement, recorded in his journal a vision that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Upon entering the central hall, he saw the floor open like a living maw, revealing an immense chamber filled with shifting bones. At the center, Ayame's figure floated above the pile, pale and ethereal, her eyes fixed upon him. The monk felt the weight of centuries of sorrow, the pull of unfulfilled vengeance, and a force so overwhelming that it threatened to pull him into the chamber. He fled, shaken, his hands trembling, leaving behind his offerings of incense, charms, and prayers. Even outside the fortress, he could feel her gaze, as though the wind itself carried her presence. Throughout the late 1580s, reports from the fortress reached neighboring provinces. Chroniclers, soldiers, and local authorities speculated on the source and nature of the phenomenon. One theory suggested that the human pillar acted as a conduit for spiritual energy, binding Ayame's soul to the fortress and creating a tether between the living and the dead. Others believed that Ayame's consciousness had merged with the structure itself, transforming the building into a sentient entity. Folklorists noted the consistency of the stories, despite the differing perspectives of soldiers, villagers, and travelers. The fortress had become a living legend, a nexus where history, ritual, and vengeance converged into tangible terror. By summer 1589, the manifestations had grown even more extreme. Soldiers described entire corridors illuminated by an unearthly light, revealing countless shadows moving in impossible patterns. Some saw Ayame simultaneously in multiple locations, her gaze following them no matter where they turned. Objects levitated, hovered, and then fell violently, causing injuries and shattering morale. The tapping of bones beneath the central hall became rhythmic, almost hypnotic, instilling a sense of helplessness. Those who lingered too long reported hearing whispers of their own names, accompanied by visions of their past sins, as though the fortress was passing judgment. Villagers continued to experience supernatural disturbances at a distance. Crops withered inexplicably, animals refused to enter fields near the hill, and the cries of the girl could be heard carrying on the wind for miles. Children spoke of lullabies sung in unknown voices, echoing in their dreams and waking hours alike. Hunters claimed their prey disappeared, leaving trails that led directly back to the fortress, while travelers returning home sometimes exhibited strange behavior, wandering aimlessly, speaking incoherently, or collapsing from terror without explanation. By 1590, the fortress had become a site of both fascination and dread. Scholars, soldiers, and chroniclers debated the causes and implications of the events. Some suggested that Ayame's spirit had transformed into a guardian of the fortress, simultaneously protecting it and punishing intruders. Others theorized that her soul had become a living force, merging with the structure to create a sentient, vengeful entity. A few believed that the repeated rituals and sacrifices over centuries might have awakened an energy far beyond human comprehension, one that could manipulate perception, matter, and time itself. Despite the differences in interpretation, all accounts agreed on one thing. The fortress was no longer merely a building. It had become a living monument to human cruelty, desperation, and the supernatural. The winter of 1591 brought the climax of phenomena. A violent storm struck the hill, lightning illuminating the fortress in stark spectral flashes. Soldiers reported that the entire structure seemed to shiver, walls bending subtly, towers trembling. Shadows poured from windows, coalescing into ghostly figures, some resembling ayame, others grotesque amalgamations of human shapes. The tapping from beneath the central hall intensified into a deafening rhythm, accompanied by cries that seemed to pierce the stone itself. Those present described a sensation of weightlessness, as if the floor could no longer support them, and a pull toward the central pillar that threatened to drag them into its depths. Amid these events, several explanations emerged. Some chroniclers argued that the human pillar had fused the physical and spiritual worlds, creating a conduit for Ayami's anguish to manifest. Others proposed that her presence had created a feedback loop. Fear, observation, and attention amplified the supernatural activity. Local legends evolved rapidly, intertwining the fortress's architectural history with morality tales about ambition, cruelty, and the consequences of human sacrifice. Even modern interpretations suggest that rituals like Ningyo-bashira could have psychological and social effects that were later interpreted as paranormal, reinforcing the fortress's terrifying reputation across generations. The phenomena were not limited to the fortress itself. Witnesses reported that nearby forests seemed to warp during storms, trees bent unnaturally, shadows flickered independently of light, and cold drafts carried the faint sound of sobbing and scraping. Travelers occasionally stumbled into the hill at night, drawn by an irresistible compulsion, only to be found hours later, disoriented and pale, whispering incoherently about a girl in white, bones clattering beneath the stone, and walls that seemed alive. By all accounts, the fortress had become a focal point of energy, a place where history, human sacrifice, and supernatural force coalesced into a singular, horrifying presence. By 1592, the fortress's legend had solidified into a narrative of caution, awe, and terror. Chroniclers, monks, soldiers, and villagers all described consistent features: a pale girl in white, soft sobbing, scraping and tapping sounds, objects moving without cause, shadows that defied physics, and a palpable sensation of being observed. Scholars debated endlessly whether these events were the result of spiritual energy, a sentient curse, or psychological projection amplified by fear and isolation. Local authorities avoided the hill entirely after dark, and maps marked the fortress as cursed territory. Thus, the fortress remained a testament to both human ambition and the consequences of cruelty. The human pillar had anchored not only the structure, but an enduring supernatural force, one that defied explanation and terrorized all who ventured near. Soldiers, villagers, travelers, and chroniclers bore witness to a phenomenon that blurred the line between life and death, stone and spirit, history and legend. The fortress stood firm, unyielding, yet alive with Ayami's sorrow and rage, a climax of centuries of fear and ritual, anchored forever by the bones of a girl whose sacrifice had become eternal. The fortress, by the end of the 1590s, had cemented its place in history, not merely as a military stronghold, but as a locus of legend and horror. Every structure, every corridor, every stone seemed infused with the restless consciousness of the human pillar. Observers across generations would come to see it as a living entity, simultaneously protective, punitive, and incomprehensibly powerful. Theories proliferated, but the truth remained elusive. Ayami's presence persisted, bound to the fortress, a force impossible to ignore. A warning from history that some acts of desperation leave marks that time cannot erase. By the dawn of 1593, the fortress had acquired a reputation that stretched far beyond the province. Travelers, merchants, and wandering monks spoke in hushed tones of a place where stone breathed. Shadows moved independently, and the cries of a girl buried centuries ago could be heard in the wind. The once celebrated stronghold had become a monument of terror, a nexus where human sacrifice, ambition, and the supernatural converged. Even in the early morning light, the fortress exuded an oppressive aura. Soldiers stationed in the surrounding area reported a persistent heaviness in the air, a sensation that their movements were watched by unseen eyes. Travelers passing along the valley sometimes glimpsed a figure in white at the battlements, standing silently against the horizon, staring unblinkingly at anyone who dared approach. Occasionally they swore the fortress seemed to shift subtly, walls tilting, towers stretching, as if observing the world outside its stones. Villagers told stories that grew darker with each retelling. Some spoke of doors opening in their homes with no wind, of tools disappearing only to reappear lodged in impossible places. Children continued to dream of lullabies sung in ethereal voices, the same ones carried on the wind near the hill. Livestock avoided fields that sloped toward the fortress, refusing to enter certain pastures, while the cries of Ayame could still be heard echoing on stormy nights, soft and distant yet unmistakable. Even decades later, the fortress maintained its eerie influence. Chroniclers in the early 1600s noted that the stones remained remarkably intact, impervious to time and weather, yet imbued with a palpable tension. Shadows moved in ways that defied natural explanation, and strange lights appeared intermittently in windows and along corridors. Travelers who dared to pass by often returned with tales of disorientation, cold chills, and a subtle but unshakable feeling of being watched. Some attempted to rationalize the events. Scholars and monks proposed that the human pillar had become a conduit, bridging the material and spiritual worlds. Others suggested that Ayame's consciousness had fused with the fortress itself, transforming it into a living entity. Folklorists posited that the recurring stories could be a product of mass suggestion, fear amplified over generations. Yet all accounts shared common elements: a pale figure in white, cries echoing through stone, shadows moving independently, and an unexplainable sensation of weight or pull near the central hall. The most unsettling reports often came from those who stayed closest to the fortress. Soldiers who lived within its walls described waking in the middle of the night to see Ayame standing at the end of corridors, pale and motionless, her gaze fixed upon them. They spoke of hearing the rhythmic tapping of bones beneath the floor, of whispers that seemed to anticipate their movements, and of cold drafts brushing their skin despite closed doors and sealed windows. Some tried to flee, but the fortress seemed to resist their departure. Corridors twisting, staircases lengthening, and doors locking as if to delay their escape. Occasionally, outsiders caught glimpses of impossible phenomena. A merchant traveling through the valley recounted seeing the fortress floating above the hill during a thunderstorm, its windows glowing an otherworldly white. A wandering monk claimed that during meditation near the fortress, he could hear a chorus of voices, some pleading, some screaming, some whispering in a tongue he could not understand, emanating from the stones themselves. Those who attempted to climb the hill after dark described feeling as though the air itself pressed against them, unseen hands guiding or restraining them, and shadows that moved faster than any human could. By the turn of the century, the fortress had cemented itself in local lore as a place of enduring mystery. Travelers, scholars, and even rulers spoke of it as a location where natural law seemed suspended, where human perception could be deceived, and where the restless spirit of Ayame maintained her presence. Attempts to document or explain the phenomena in writing often failed. Journals would be found shredded or water-damaged, and sketches of the fortress sometimes appeared distorted, with corridors bending unnaturally, towers appearing impossibly tall, and windows glowing faintly even on sunny days. Some villagers came to view the fortress with a mixture of fear and reverence. Offerings of food, incense, and prayers were left at the base of the hill, though no one could be certain if they were received or acknowledged. Stories circulated of those who approached too closely vanishing entirely, returning days later in a disoriented state, or never returning at all. Over time, these tales became warnings to children, travelers, and even soldiers. The fortress was a living entity, and curiosity carried consequences beyond comprehension. Modern observers, centuries later, still record similar experiences. Archaeologists examining the ruins report cold spots, inexplicable drafts, and fleeting visual phenomena that cannot be traced to structural causes. Locals tell of lights flickering in the ruins, strange sounds emanating from deep below, and shadows that seem to move of their own volition. Despite the passage of centuries, the fortress remains a place where human perception meets the unknown, a testament to the consequences of ritual, ambition, and sacrifice. In the end, the fortress stands as it always has, enduring, immovable, and yet undeniably alive. Its stones carry the weight of centuries of human fear, grief, and superstition. The human pillar, Ayame, remains at its core, a silent witness to generations of visitors, soldiers, and villagers. Her presence is subtle yet pervasive, a faint tap beneath the stone, a whisper on the wind, a shadow that flickers just beyond sight. No one knows whether she continues to guard, to punish, or merely to exist. The legend endures because it cannot be fully explained. The fortress is not merely a place of history or architecture. It is a locus of the inexplicable, a reminder that some acts of desperation leave marks that outlast time itself. Whether Ayame's spirit is conscious, vengeful, or merely restless, no one can say. What is certain is that the fortress continues to exert an influence on all who come near, drawing the curious, the brave, and the unwary alike into its shadow. And so, the hill remains, the fortress standing against wind, rain and time, its walls silent yet alive, the human pillar buried beneath at its heart. Travelers hear whispers, shadows move, and the faint rhythmic tapping of bones echoes through the stone. Whether a warning, a memory, or something else entirely, the presence of Ayame endures, a story without end, a question without answer, a mystery as alive today as it was centuries ago. No record can claim to capture the entirety of what occurs within or around the fortress. Visitors leave with fragmented memories, whispers of sounds and sights that vanish when recounted aloud. Some refuse to speak of it at all, while others can only shake their heads in disbelief. The hill, the fortress, and the human pillar exist outside the normal boundaries of explanation. They are both monument and warning, history and legend, physical structure and living terror, intertwined in ways no one has yet unraveled. Even now, the stones remain. The central hall holds its secret, and the pale girl waits. Her presence is a constant, a pulse beneath the stone, a shadow on the wall, a whisper carried on the wind. Time passes, generations change, yet the fortress stands, impervious to human understanding, eternal in its mystery. The story ends, or perhaps it never does. For those who approach the hill, the fortress, the human pillar, the question remains: will you hear the tapping? Will you see the shadow? Will you feel the weight of a sorrow that has endured centuries? Or will you leave untouched, carrying only the memory of a tale too strange, too vast, and too alive to ever fully comprehend? The fortress waits. The bones rest, the whispers continue, and the legend endures. The fortress waits. The wind carries her whispers, the shadows move, and the faint tapping of bones echoes beneath the stone. Ayame's presence lingers, silent yet undeniable, a reminder that some legacies of fear and sorrow never fade. Travelers pass, soldiers come and go, yet the fortress holds its secrets, watching, remembering, and refusing to let the story end. And though centuries have passed, the whispers remain, calling to those curious enough to listen. If the tale of the human pillar and the cursed fortress sent shivers down your spine, there are countless more stories waiting, hidden in the shadows, whispered through history, and alive for those who dare to uncover them. To continue walking these dark corridors of mystery with us, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Join us as we explore legends, uncover horrors, and bring the unknown into the light.